that the impact and the intent around communication are different things, right? And this is related to something we talked about earlier with force and power. It's very rare that a leader intends, to upset somebody or intends to make somebody frightened. And yet the fact that isn't your intent as a leader doesn't mitigate the fact that may have been the impact that you had. And so I think, and this gets harder the more successful you are, right? The more successful you are, the more prominent a figure you are, the more you're going to have an unintended impact. And so being able to kind of see yourself, and there's this great metaphor from the leadership literature. Can you get up on the balcony and simultaneously watch yourself on the dance floor? I think that's very relevant here. Can you observe yourself as you're communicating and interacting with people? And can you observe your impact on them? Because it may be very distinct from the intended impact.
So my guest today is Ed Batista, a renowned exec coach and very famous lecturer at Stanford Business School. He's really known for training generations of leaders and for developing Edbot, which is an AI built on GPT that is trained on hundreds and hundreds of leadership essays that can actually play a role in helping executive leaders work through different challenges and issues using AI. And in our conversation today, one of the big takeaways for me is how big emotional undercurrents, how big a factor they are in team dynamics, in leadership, in decision-making. And the tool is having an exec coach that can come in and work with leadership to uncover those undercurrents, to have another partner in the business to say, wow, here's the layers underneath, and here's how to think about organizational dynamics and decision-making and how people will work together, think about excitement, think about fear, all those different dynamics being able to be seen and solved when you have the right tool, the right partner, the right exec coach to help co-lead you through that. So today's discussion is really about the head and the heart, putting it all together and solving problems in a different way. I hope you enjoy the conversation with Ed. All right, very excited to have Ed Batista, exec coach here. I've known Ed for over a decade, taught at Stanford, and it has been my exec coach for a little bit. And one thing that kind of sparked this idea of having Ed on the show is a lot of people actually ask me about exec coaching as CEO, right? Which is like, okay, is it worth it? How do you use it? People have tried different coaches and different methods, and it's been a little different. So it's so glad to have Ed here, kind of sharing his experience. Ed, welcome.
Thanks, Ian. I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, so you've had a lot of experience as a CEO yourself, as a coach, as a leader, and you've got some really great articles. If you want to mention any, we can add them in the show notes. But exec coaching, right? Just maybe kind of start off like how should we think? How should CEOs or executives think about exec coaching just overall versus all the other things that they can do in the world?
Yeah, well, first let me just qualify. I can talk about coaching, and I'm not speaking for all coaches, across the world. I've got to really just be grounded in my own perspective. And I've been doing it for a long time. I launched my coaching practice in 2006. I actually looked it up. I've conducted 9,864 coaching sessions over the course of my career. So I should be hitting 10,000 or sometime around the end of the year. Maybe by then I'll know what I'm doing. And let me talk about what coaching is by sort of saying a little bit about how I got exposed to it. So I went, you and I both have a history at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I went to the GSB because I wanted to help NGOs use technology more effectively, and Stanford was a really good place to pursue that mission. I graduated and got exactly the job that I had written about in my application essay. I was tasked as the first executive director to bring together a consortium, really a kind of a global community of technology companies that were interested in helping NGOs, some charitable foundations that invested in infrastructure, and a whole host of people who were doing this work on the ground in different communities all over the US and outside. And so I was super passionate about this mission. And at the time, I thought that my responsibility as leader was to come up with the best ideas and champion them really aggressively. And I had a guy on my board of directors, a guy named Vince Staley, who turned out to be a terrific mentor of mine. And at one point, he took me aside and he said, in a very in a kind way, a supportive way, but also indicating there would be some consequences here. Hey, you're a talented guy and you have some rough edges. I encourage you to invest in yourself and go get an executive coach. And I did not know what that was. I didn't know what coaching was. It was the first time I'd heard about it. And yet I knew that I had a professor, a woman named Marianne Huckabee, who I took interpersonal dynamics with at the GSB. And she had a coaching practice. So I went back to her and said, hey, would you take me on as a coach? And she said, yeah, sure. So I worked with her for a couple of years, and it radically changed my approach to leadership. And these folks who I was kind of getting in these antagonistic, struggles with, we became allies, and ultimately I had a much more effective experience. So it was, a guide, a person who I could trust, a person who I could talk with, because there were certainly issues that I couldn't talk about as openly with members of my board or employees or other people in the community. Someone I could talk to who wasn't a friend or a family member, who wasn't just going to sort of take my side, who was going to call me on my BS when necessary. So it was a really profound kind of eye-opening experience. And long story short, I'm actually still working with Marianne. She is still my coach. We haven't worked together continuously for a quarter century, but we've been working together continuously since 2009, a couple years after I launched my own practice.
Very cool. And when you think about, I think you had this, what I heard there was, sometimes a leader has some rough edges. And and how do you smooth those things out? And exec coaches, I think one way. There's a whole bunch of different things exec coaching provides, and I'm kind of curious when you think about, like, sometimes there's advisors, sometimes there's mentors, sometimes there's people that help train us, and then there's exec coaching. How do you think about exec coaching, just in your context, in your opinion, on that continuum of all the different things that executives and leaders can do to sort of self-improve?
Yeah, I think coaching involves all of those disciplines at different times. And there are certainly, and I let prospective clients know, hey, there are a number of patterns that repeat themselves in a leader's life or in the development of an organization, in the launch and growth of a startup, and when a small group of people get together to pursue something, like as the executive team evolves, there are a lot of patterns, and so I will certainly see some patterns emerge in a client, and I might say, hey, I've seen similar circumstances in other clients' experiences. Let me share with you some of those experiences. Sometimes that happens in the course of a coaching session. It's very much the case that pretty much everything I write, I've written over 1,000 articles, is drawn from the experiences of several clients who've kind of gone through similar circumstances. And so there's certainly lots of times when I will be sharing information, which sometimes is quite specific and pointed. It's not as if I'm only asking questions. That said, I'm also erring on the side of asking questions, and for a very simple reason. My clients are always going to know more about themselves as individuals. They're going to know more about their companies. They're going to know more about their the technology that they're deploying. They're going to know more about their market and their customers than I ever will. Like, they're always going to have so much more information, no matter how long we work together. So if I'm only offering guidance, offering advice, we're missing an opportunity to tap the expertise that my client has, and we're kind of leaning on my expertise, which is a big mismatch. I'd say a category error. And so I will certainly emphasize asking questions, but it's also, the questions are not sort of like generic. It's really about building a relationship in which I understand what's the most useful question that I can ask a client right here. Can I ask a question that's going to be, usefully provocative, not unnecessarily provocative, right? They're questions that can feel kind of like, they can leave someone feeling vulnerable or raw. That's not my intent. But there are also questions that could be really kind of generic and anodyne. It's really about sort of picking the right question at the right moment and weaving in, some advice and guidance along the way.
And definitely, I've actually had a number of coaches. I've worked with some of the folks that exactly just said are more advisory, like they're a CEO. This is how they did it. Ex-military, very regimented. Others that have done more broad, systematic processes, and then had ones that had worked at like McKinsey and just had done a whole bunch of like really strategic thinking. And I feel like in coaching, I always get something out of that session. It's kind of like that song, The Gambler. There's the ace that I can keep, and there's some small stuff and there's some bigger stuff. When you and there's folks that I talk to that are like, well, I don't know if I need a coach. I can kind of get to it myself. And what I find is, yeah, that's kind of true, but there's a bunch of sort of it's almost like you have this sort of guaranteed, like, okay, I'm going to take this time away and I'm going to get to some aha moments that are going to be produced by this, almost sort of systematically. That's what I personally have sort of seen. When you think about the most effective coaching sessions, like what can a leader, how does a leader show up to a coaching session to sort of get the maximum, result out of it? Like what's the mindset, or what have you seen that works the best?
Yeah, well, and I think you highlight a couple of key points. One is coaching comes in a sort of a million different sort of flavors and varieties, and in fact, coach is often, like, I think, kind of a problematic term. I mean, at least in the U.S., the way we understand coach is often as like an athletic coach, a football coach, who is kind of like the field marshal, the general, the guy who gives all of the like directions and instructions, and sometimes in a very like sort of harsh authoritative way. That's a form of coaching, to be sure. And it's even a form of executive coaching, right? There's some executive coaches who step in and say, "Hey, here's my playbook. You got to, I'm going to tell you how to run your organization," or even like, I'm going to chair your executive team meeting for a while, and then you can adopt my style. That's fine, right? That's a very viable form of coaching. It's not how I coach, and it's certainly not how. It's not for everybody. So I think the critical question to ask yourself as a leader, if you're considering coaching, is what do I think would benefit me, and can I talk to a sufficiently large number of coaches? You don't have to interview 20 coaches, but talk to multiple coaches so you get a sense of their different styles and their different approaches. There's actually a piece on my website called "How to Find and Choose a Coach," which you might want to point to people to, because it includes a set of questions to ask, both to ask yourself before talking with a coach and to ask a coach to kind of get a sense of, well, what is their style? And I think that said, I think there are some themes that characterize effective coaching sessions and effective coaching engagements and relationships. One is related to something that you just said. It's a chance for a leader to kind of step back from the immediate press of like sort of tactical decision making and just first like take some time for themselves. And it's not like recreational time, but it really is very much focused on like, well, how am I doing? A dilemma for the leader is, by definition, the leader is usually thinking about everybody else, right? How are they doing? How is how are my employees doing? How are my investors doing? How is the board doing? How are my customers doing? And for the leader to just have some dedicated time to sit back and say, well, how am I doing? I mean, that itself could be extremely useful. So I think, and that's most useful when, it's well, first when you commit to it, right? A coaching session is not useful if it's not held. So, one of the things I check for in a prospective client is, are you in a place, or are you at a time in your life and at a time in the business when you can reliably take some time out, and you just kind of put the business to the side and reflect. Not everybody can do that, especially early on, maybe just in the first couple of months of a company's existence. People are running around like their hair's on fire, and the idea of taking an hour and just sort of reflecting in conversation with another person about what's going on for the leader, like how would I do that? I can't possibly imagine doing that. So kind of committing to a regular routine. And here too, coaches vary. My standard practice is I meet for an hour, and typically every 3 to 4 weeks. And, that's probably a little bit less often than I'd say many coaches work with clients every other week. That's a very typical cadence. Some coaches work with clients every week. That's also, not uncommon. One of the reasons why I see clients on a longer cadence, is that I tend to work with clients for a longer period of time. Average tenure in my practice is about 4 years. And so that tells you, I work with folks for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. You and I have worked together for some time, Ian. And that lends itself, I find, very well to a less frequent cadence, 3 or 4 weeks, sometimes even once a month. I'd say one other, aspect is that as a consequence, that both coach and client feel like they get to know each other fairly well. let folks know, hey, we may well talk about aspects of life beyond the parameters of the business, simply because there's often a kind of dynamic interplay. Like what's happening in other domains of life can affect how the leader is showing up, in the business, and certainly what's happening in the business can affect how the leader is showing up in other domains of life and other relationships. So that's not an obligation. I don't require folks to talk about anything outside the business, but it's often the case that we wind up talking about other aspects of life over the course of a long-term coaching engagement. And I find that also enables me to do better coaching because I've got more information about what's going on, in the client's experience.
Yeah, 100%. And super curious about like what is the because as we work together, there's certain moments. There was one where I think you said something. It's like, hey, Ian, I think you've brought this up like 4 or 5 times in a row, like every
Yeah.
time, and you sort of haven't solved it yet. And it surprised me because you're 100% right. And just kind of looking at that sort of, I just took a step back. I'm like, I am not solving the root issue. And I think that
Mhm.
was it's something that in theory I could have figured out for myself, but it was just in that moment, it was so useful that I'm kind of curious. I'm kind of curious, what are the other patterns that you kind of notice? If you think of the pie chart of
Mhm.
executives that you work with, and that is one where it's sort of like I kind of could figure out what the underlying problem was, but it just kept recurring, and I kept sort of nibbling around I kept trying to solve the symptoms rather than the root cause. And I'm kind of curious, like, what are the other sort of patterns you see as you work with executives that just kind of come up over and over again? Like, what are the sort of the biggest slices if it was a pie chart?
Yeah, well, and let me just say, like, on that, with your observation there, I think that reflects a couple of really important themes in coaching. One is there's value simply in my reflecting back, like, hey, this, we're here again, we're talking about this again. What does that mean? And I'm not necessarily coming in and telling you what that means, but I'm just making that observation, allowing you to then, kind of come to the conclusion of like, oh yeah, like I haven't resolved this issue. It's also I'd say clients aren't accountable to me. You're not accountable to me, but I can be an accountability partner in some ways, simply by highlighting, hey, you had made a commitment to yourself that this was going to happen, and it hasn't happened yet. What does that mean? What's gotten in the way? Is there something that you want to is there something you can point to that is an obstacle or a barrier? Is it, possibly the case that it wasn't really that important to begin with? Like it was sort of like a nice to have, but not really a necessary, accomplishment. So there are ways that I can be useful really just by kind of showing up, reflecting back, making some observations, but, certainly not as someone to whom a client is accountable. Another theme that comes up quite a bit is recognizing that the leader has to evolve his or her style, and effectiveness along with the business, right? Like what a business needs when it's 10 people pre-revenue, is very different than what a business needs when it's 10,000 people and at $1 billion. So the leader is undoubtedly going to be a different person along that journey. They're not going to be static. I think a very effective role that coaching can play is, again, kind of reflecting back, like, hey, and some of this is again, like, an opinion, like here's, I'm offering feedback isn't quite the right way to frame it, but kind of just sharing some advice, some perspective of observations that I've made from leaders in similar circumstances as they've made a journey. A theme that comes up quite a bit, and maybe another piece that you might want to point people to, I call it force isn't power. As at earlier stages in our sort of lives and careers, we often feel the need to act very forcefully. We have to act very energetically. We got to speak, with a lot of intensity, and occasionally, like, we got to lose our temper, right, to make things happen. And the dilemma is that as the company grows and becomes more successful, the leader's impact, the leader's weight, the weight of the leader's words becomes, much heavier, much more intense. And so the leader who communicates the same way that he or she did at the beginning of the journey, like years later, is likely going to overshoot the mark. And in some cases, like, be unnecessarily, intense or unintentionally frighten people. That's not helpful. Doesn't mean, in the least, that leaders shouldn't lose their temper. But if they do, it should be deliberately. It should be, not unintentionally. And so kind of helping a leader understand, Is the way that I tend to communicate, is my sort of natural style, is it allowing me to accomplish my goals, today? If so, great. And if not, what can I change? But certainly as the company changes and as my role changes, especially if I continue to be, I mean, I work with a lot of founder CEOs like you. If I continue to occupy that seat, I'm probably going to have a more intensive kind of impact on people than I intend. So can I, and it's not about it's certainly not about being nice, but it's about recognizing that, I may be communicating in a way that's too forceful, too intense, and I've got to kind of be a little bit more attuned to what are the dials at my disposal. Can I show up in just the right way that has the desired impact?
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to talk a little bit more about force is not power, and that kind of concept, which is we've had, like, as we promote people at our company, there's this kind of interesting effect. They get elevated and they're like, wow, people don't come with as many tactical issues anymore. Now that I'm in this position, I'm actually operating at a higher level. So I think that's a good thing. The other is, in whether it's a promotion or getting a little bit more of the spotlight, the way that people are acting within their function, they're like, oh, this is broken and that's broken. We need to fix this. When they get elevated and they're speaking in the same way, they're like freaking people out, right? Because they're like, well, no, I'm just talking about the stuff that's broken. But now when you have someone in an elevated position say the exact same thing that they said like a week ago, but now it's cross-functional, they can send sort of shockwaves through. They're like, oh my God, does that mean like this thing's not going to happen? Is this going to collapse? So it's so interesting that force is not power, and as people get elevated, that decorum and that has to change. Like, what have you seen in that world? Force is not power, and this concept of communication, and how power actually gets conveyed through communication and position.
Yeah, well, you remind me of a founder CEO I worked with some years ago, and he was a sort of a product visionary. This was his baby, and he reached a certain point where the company had become quite sizable. And he said, I find it actually hard to continue to participate in product development meetings, because if I say something like, "Oh, I kind of liked the blue," everyone's like, "He said make it blue. You got to change it back to blue." And he's like, "That's not what I intended." I mean, that was a key moment for me in realizing, oh, the leader's got to be really attuned to the unintended weight of their communications. Now, it doesn't mean you have to sit out of those kinds of conversations, but it does mean just being attuned to, like, well, how am I communicating and how are people perceiving it? It's also important to bear in mind that there is a difference between your intention and your impact, right? You may not intend it to be very forceful, but it may be perceived. It may come across in a way that's extremely forceful. It's also very relevant to an issue that I talk with a lot about people. Andy Grove has this great concept in Only the Paranoid Survive, where he talks about different kinds of fear. Right? He basically says there's a kind of fear that you have to have in a company, and that's the fear of losing. Right? People have to be scared of losing. He's like, that's a really powerful motivator when people are scared of losing. But at the same time, he says there's a kind of fear that you must not have in a company, and that's the fear of speaking up. If people are scared to speak up, if people are scared to bring bad news, then suddenly the flow of information from the periphery to the center dries up. And you as a leader, now you're flying blind. You don't have people sharing bad news with you. You don't have people coming to you and saying, "Hey, I'm sorry, this went, this did not go to plan. This failed." And then when, then things will kind of bite you in the ass and surprise you. And a lot of that has to do with how you're communicating as a leader. So helping. And again, this is very much, it's not about being nice, right? You do, I mean, and I think there are lots of reasons to also be able to convey warmth and positivity and enthusiasm, but I'm certainly not suggesting those should be like the only tones in a leader's communication style. Sometimes, sometimes there's a crisis, sometimes there's an emergency, sometimes things went really badly, and you've got to be able to communicate, with directness. There's not going to be a lot of time for like warmth and effusiveness. But even in those moments, and maybe especially in those moments, it's important to be able to ensure that people are not scared to speak up, to share bad news. This is related to the concept of psychological safety, which we talk a lot about. Another piece I would encourage you to point people to, I call, safety is a resource, not a destination. The work on psychological safety derives largely from the work of a woman named Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School, and I've had an exchange with her in which we've clarified what she really means by that is that people feel free to speak up. Subordinates feel free to speak up and share bad news without fear of punishment or reprisal from superiors. It doesn't mean that everybody's nice and that nobody's feelings get hurt. So I think, the misunderstanding of what we mean by psychological safety these days has really been kind of problematic. I think it's left a lot of leaders feeling like, oh, I got to walk on eggshells. I can't be direct. I can't be intense when that would be necessary. I can't offer critical feedback. That's not what we mean by psychological safety. That's a misunderstanding of psychological safety. And bringing it back to coaching, a lot of what I do is talk with leaders about, well, how do you create an environment in which people feel free to speak up and share bad news? They're not scared of you, and everyone's still scared of losing. People still want to win quite badly.
Yeah, 100%. One of the things that we've been doing, and we need to get it more consistent, is like green, yellow, red. It's like, yes, there's bad news, but it's green, right? Like that means, we've got this sort of budget for delays and we've eaten at our budget, but we're not over budget, right? That's kind of like a green, maybe it's a yellow. And then there's red, which is like, hit the button. And I think the qualitative piece is less clear cross-functionally. So we got to get the green, yellow, red. Within a function, it's really easy. Cross-functional, that's something that, just we're working on this week. So
Yeah,
really
yeah.
appreciate that. So we want to take a look at that. That I love that piece on fear and the different types and making sure it's you don't have that fear of communication. Just on maybe one last thing on coaching, when you think about like the develop, like one of the key classes at the GSB was on coaching. And I made the mistake of not taking that. And I didn't realize so many people were like, it was competitive to get in. There's only so many seats. I missed that class. When you think about executives being coaches for their managers and as part of the sort of toolkit of leadership, how do you think about like, what does it mean to be a great coach for your own people? Like, what are the behaviors? What are the philosophies to be a great coach for others?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's important that we distinguish between coaching as a toolkit and a mindset versus coaching as a relationship, right? The difference is really important because as a leader, you're attached to a particular outcome. Right, you want certain things to happen. You and your employees, assuming there's sufficient alignment, like you're aiming towards a particular goal. The distinction for me as a coach, I'm not attached in quite the same way. I want my clients to win by the definition of their choosing. I'm certainly here to do my utmost to help and assist in that process. But I have a different kind of relationship to the client's goals than you do as a leader to your employees' goals. But in both cases, right, you can be very thoughtful and deliberate about saying, well, I can apply coaching as a toolkit and a mindset. It often starts with just, am I asking questions? I think for a leader, very often, especially earlier in their careers, you gain effectiveness as a leader by having the answer, right? People come to you, I have a problem, I have the solution, here's the answer. And that works well up to a certain point. The dilemma is that, as you succeed, as you grow, as you begin to hire more capable people, they don't necessarily need or even want to be told the answer. They do want a thought partner. They want someone who can be an unblocker. They want someone who can kind of maybe help them expand their thinking. Occasionally they want the answer too, but that's not necessarily the only reason or the first reason why they're coming to talk to you as a leader. So, one, and people may come to you and say, hey, I'd like the answer. And you could say, well, I have some opinions. I'll give you some thoughts, but first let me ask you some questions. Let's see if we can surface some additional information here. Another way to think about coaching as a mindset is after you're asking those kind of useful and hopefully open-ended questions, are you listening effectively? A lot of times we can tell that someone's listening and they're not really hearing us. They're taking in information, but they're really thinking about what they're going to say next. They're thinking about how to respond. I think I find it useful when talking with folks about coaching as a skill and a capability that you can develop, to recognize that just because you're absorbing information doesn't mean that the other person feels heard. So are you showing up with them in a way that really allows them to feel heard? Sometimes that itself is extremely useful. Lastly, I'd say empathizing. being able to empathize with the challenge that an employee is facing. Empathy is a critical skill in any coaching relationship, but it's also critical for an employer, for a superior, to be able to empathize with the challenges that an employee is bringing with them. And I say that knowing that sometimes folks say, well, but that's I have a problem with that because that maybe I asked them to do this hard thing and they're coming and they're frustrated or they're concerned about that. Should I be empathizing with them? A theme that I highlight with clients quite a bit is empathy is not the same thing as agreement. Empathy is not agreement, right? We can empathize, and it's particularly important if we've asked somebody to do a hard thing and they're struggling with it and they're frustrated. We can empathize with that frustration. We can empathize with the struggle without agreeing that we shouldn't be trying to accomplish the hard thing. Now that's it's easy to say, it's hard to put into practice. Easy to say that empathy is not agreement. That's hard to do. And so sometimes my work with clients is very simply, what will it look like to be able to express empathy and still hold fast to the position, to your point of view that, we have to go do this hard thing.
Wow. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The empathy and just being able to agree that we want to do this hard thing, but also sort of being there for the other person, understanding it. And when you think about the sort of nearly 10,000 hours of coaching you've done over almost 20 years, and this concept of self-coaching that you've sort
Mm.
of discussed and talked about. So how do you change gears from this concept of being with someone who can be everything from an accountability partner to a mirror to an advisor to this concept of self-coaching, and what can leaders do sort of on their own in the moment or in a structured way? What does that look like for self-coaching?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that because that's been a very important part of my career, this concept of self-coaching. And it actually has its origins in the GSB. So I spent 15 years as a lecturer and leadership coach at the business school, and I had a student, and I believe he graduated in 2009. And he was about to become an entrepreneur. He said, "I'm gonna found my own company," and I've benefited tremendously. He was in the coaching class that you didn't take, Ian. And he said, "I really benefited from the coaching resources that have been afforded to me here at Stanford. And I'm not going to be able to pay for a coach in my next professional role. How do I coach myself?" And it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me because at that point I'd been coaching for 3 or 4 years. I'd been writing quite a bit, and I realized I actually have quite I have a meaningful body of material that I could make available to people and share with them, to who found themselves in a position where they weren't able to work directly with a coach, and that was over 15 years ago. Since then, how I've evolved my way of thinking about self-coaching is that it is a self-directed process, but it is not necessarily a solitary process. Look, one of the things that I highlight with clients, as often as I might work with a client, we're still probably going to spend about 1% of our working hours together. So 99% of the time, my client is out there working their way through all sorts of challenges. Not with me by their side. The coaching that I do with a client really is it's an activity that takes place in a sort of off hours, and is a form of very sort of distilled reflection that should have a long-term implications and be very beneficial in the remaining 99% of their working hours. And the relationship that we have is I'm kind of one member of a client's coaching team, you might say. And I play a special role because I'm a full-time dedicated professional, but clients have lots of folks in their lives who they may also have coaching conversations with along the lines of, coaching as a toolkit and a mindset, not just a relationship. And in all of those, different conversations, different settings, the client is still the common factor. So the client self-coaching, I think of it as a self-directed process of being responsible for one's own growth and development as a leader, especially during times of change and transition. And sometimes that entails having a one-on-one conversation with a coach. But that's not the only aspect of the self-coaching process. It may also entail having more thoughtful developmental conversations with peers, with friends and family members. It certainly entails some reading, some study. I'm a big believer in the value of doing some kind of journaling. It doesn't have to happen on a daily basis. I think a lot of people feel like, oh, when I'm told to journal, it's like what I did in middle school. I'm going to have to, write down and capture every detail of what my day was like. That works for some people. It doesn't work for most people.
Can you say a little bit more about journaling? Yeah,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
so
Well,
I think it's become kind of a meme. Like, what does it
yeah,
mean to effectively journal?
I think the critical factor is, are you have you constructed a process in such a way that you want to continue with it, right? A lot of people journal for a period of time and then fall off, and I'd say the simple reason for that is because they have an idea of what journaling is supposed to be that doesn't really fit with the way they want to do it. And so, look, a lot of people are very good at sort of like, kind of buckling down and saying, well, this is the way it's supposed to be. I guess I'll stick at it. I'll stick with it for a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, but that'd be a stretch. And the sad thing is that there's actually a lot of research on the benefits of journaling. I mean, for example, when we journal about emotional experiences, it enables us to process and work through those emotions much more effectively, even if we never go back and read what's written. The one of the benefits, and maybe the key benefit of the act of journaling, is it takes all of these sort of abstract and even chaotic, thoughts and emotions, and renders it into something concrete that helps us make sense of an experience, helps us make sense of the emotions that we're feeling in the wake of that experience, helps us kind of process them and work through it. And again, the dilemma though is that some people feel like, well, I guess to journal, I'm going to have to write about it. I have to write every detail about what happened, and then I have to write everything about what I feel. I mean, they basically create a process that feels way too onerous, and certainly, it's just not going to be feasible in the life of a busy leader. So I think we do know there's ample research on the effectiveness of journaling. I also know empirically from my practice that a lot of people begin some kind of journaling process and then quit because it just, again, it feels onerous. It doesn't fit. So what I advise clients to do is really like start really small, make it really simple. I mean, a journal could be a little stack of Post-its on your bedside table, and you write one bullet at the end of each day. That's a journal, right? Or whatever. I mean, pick the form that works for you. I'd say that's what's the most important thing about journaling.
I find journaling is, in terms of the concept of self-coaching, I find journaling is 100% agree. It's very helpful, but it's also incredibly hard to be consistent. And my problem is like, I'll start journaling and like, I have to do this, and I go do it. And then like, there goes the journal. And I like the concept of, one of my early coaches had this concept of like Post-it notes. So I've got all these like physical Post-it notes. And I just write it down, like, what do I have to do? And you kind of work through it and cross it off. But it's like, the consistency is so hard to keep things up as a habit all the time. So, yeah, I completely agree. What have you seen in terms of like the most successful, like, I'm just love to learn a little bit more about the research around journaling. And, you talked about everything from writing a Post-it note to being more engaged. Like, what have you seen as the range of journaling, and what have you seen as some of the positive outcomes?
I'd say with the positive outcome, I go back to is one thing I just mentioned, like the benefit of processing and working through emotional experiences. But a related aspect of it is the ability to retain memories, and that doesn't require us to go back and reread something. If we are able to, in some sense, again, like take the vast amount of kind of data that comprises an experience and distill it down to what we can write about, right? We're rendering it concrete. It makes it much more readily accessible, to our future selves, and we don't have to go back and reread it. That's one of the things I think people get kind of stuck on or hung up on. They think, oh, I've got to document everything. Well, no, you don't, right? And I think one of the benefits of committing to a repeatable process is it's not going to be it's not going to take very much time, right? And again, people have a kind of idealized version and say, oh, if I can't journal for an hour while sitting over a cup of tea and staring out, at the sunset, then it's not going to be very effective. Well, I don't know about you. Well, actually, I do know about you, Ian. I know that you don't have an hour to sit and stare at the sunset and journal over a cup of tea. At most you're gonna have a couple of minutes. And in that sense, you're very consistent with the other leaders I work with. So finding something that is a repeatable motion, right? A practice that you can commit to, and it may not be daily, right? Daily may not be the right cadence. Maybe it's weekly. Monthly is probably insufficient, but who knows? Again, it's really up to the person. It's up to the individual to decide what works best for him or her. And the key is recognizing that we are going to be journaling about the events that stand out because they were meaningful or had some kind of emotional impact, right? Everything else is going to be discarded. This is not about some kind of like comprehensive data capture. And I think actually, like, we have access to too much information these days, right? We don't, but the dilemma is not the availability of information. The dilemma is the time that we have, the constraint is the time that we have to kind of process and work through information. So I, very strongly encourage people, don't worry about making a kind of comprehensive record of an experience or your response to it. It's, what stands out to you because it was meaningful or emotional. Those are the things that are going to matter most. And if you do even just, a little bit of writing about them, you're going to render them more readily accessible to you in the future.
Excellent. I 100% agree. When you think about like these patterns, so self-coaching is one, journaling is another. We talk about, what are the leverageable patterns? I mean, this podcast is about tools for tech leaders, and there's a whole bunch of tools we talked about today. The concept of tool is like, here's a problem, here's a tool, and here's how I can put them together to solve that problem. What are the different sort of shapes of problems that you've seen with exec leaders? I mean, one I talked about was, hey, Ian, you've been saying this problem for like 5 or 6 times. You haven't really gotten the root, right? So the problem is, haven't hit the root issue. The tool is just noticing that and being in a conversation where you can take a step back and notice that and solve it. What are the patterns that have you seen with exec coaching or self-coaching that show up, and what is the tool that a leader might have in place, whether it's bring that to an exec coaching experience, self-coaching, sort of other things? What's the sort of problem solution tool set that you've seen that is, repeating itself over and over?
You bet. Well, I'd say the meta pattern is emotion regulation, right? I mean, I believe, my theory is that everything can be reduced to a dilemma related to emotion regulation. Even what you just described, right? I mean, let's call that some form of procrastination. When we procrastinate, there may be many contributing factors, but typically, there is also, some kind of emotional aversion, right? I think about this thing, I should be doing it, and oh no, I'm going to go get distracted by something else. Well, it's not just the distraction; it's also the emotional aversion. But emotion regulation takes many, many different forms in my practice. It's obviously a critical factor in any interpersonal challenges, right? A big theme that comes up is like, wow, I'm as a leader, I'm really anxious. I'm scared that that I've taken on this big, this huge risk. I've gotten, if I'm a founder CEO, I've gotten people to divert their careers and come work with me. I've convinced people to give me, meaningful sums of money, and now everyone's looking at me. All eyes are on me to succeed. Boy, am I anxious and upset about. And it's not only anxious. I may be super excited too, right? There may be some real big prize. I may enjoy the pressure, and it's going to stir up a bunch of feelings. And guess what? Some of those feelings are going to leak, and I'm not going to be all that effective at how I express myself. And I'm going to probably overstep. I'm going to get mad, or I'm going to do something that inadvertently scares or upsets somebody, as we talked about earlier. And I think it's in this context really important to recognize that, emotions are not antagonistic to reason, right? We have this kind of idea in the sort of popular consciousness that, that's like hot emotions that kind of lead us off course, and it's sort of cool reason that sort of helps us, and neuroscientists and neurologists have known for decades, literally decades, that is not the way the mind works. Right? Emotion is a critical and necessary input into logical reasoning. Right? We make decisions with emotions helping to inform our interpretation of data. Like, so emotion and reason, the vast majority of time, operate in harmony. However, there are certainly times when kind of unregulated emotion leads us astray, and that's what looms large in our consciousness. We think about the times when, I lost my temper, I lost my cool. So it does happen, and there are lots of other kind of smaller, lower key emotions that we feel that can get in the way of our effective functioning. And so, and when I talk about emotion regulation being kind of a meta pattern, it's really understanding What are the circumstances that I interpret in such a way that trigger emotions that get in the way of my effective functioning? And and maybe it's like, oh, I'm procrastinating here yet again. Maybe it's I'm really anxious and I'm finding it difficult to sleep. Or maybe I'm triggered and I'm getting angry and I'm saying things I later regret. So the sort of meta pattern and the problem that shows up in almost every one of my conversations with clients is some form of emotion regulation. And the tool, the toolkit, I should say, is really wide. I mean, sometimes it's just like, are you talking about this? We can talk, in a coaching session about that, and that can be very useful. But are you also able to develop a relationship and a culture in the organization where you can talk about feeling upset? It's not, forbidden to have, difficult feelings. So if you can talk about, if you can talk about your feelings as a leader, that can be a very useful tool in down regulating difficult emotions. Journaling is very useful here too. Are you able to take some time away and write in order to process and work through some of these feelings? Mindfulness or some form of meditative practice, also really helpful in down regulating difficult emotions. So is exercise, and so is consistent sleep. So I actually talk with clients quite a lot about those kinds of tools. A mindfulness practice, regular exercise, good sleep, and not simply because I want clients to live their best lives. I do, but those are also all tools to help solve the problem or address the problem of emotion regulation.
That's awesome. That's crazy. I never thought of it that way, which is that there's a fundamental problem in leadership and teams and organizations, which is emotional regulation. And it's this kind of thing that people can kind of see, but they don't talk about, because you're exactly to your point. It's supposed to be cool logic, and emotions kind of get in the way, but they're living, breathing, and there. And then some people can't get to a logical conclusion because there's an emotion in the way. They've made a decision, they don't like it, or they do like something, and there's all this like undercurrent that just
Yeah.
makes the logic almost like useless until you can get to the emotional part. And the tool is really, as one tool is coaching, which is just kind of noticing that, having the conversation about it. If you can take it out, then you can you can address it. You can't really address it unless you can see it. That's super fascinating. We have a few tools internally, which is called take the people out, solve the problem, put the people back in. Because people get really, really, attached to things, and you got to solve the problem and like cool logic, and then put the people back in and solve it again. So to take care of the people. The other one we have is sort of day one thinking. You alluded earlier to only the paranoid survive. So that concept of like, okay, those people that made all these decisions, they're not here anymore. We're their clones. This is our first day. We don't have any of that baggage. How would we behave? And that can be really transformational. I didn't realize how big a deal those emotions, emotional regulation can actually be to making decisions. That is really fascinating.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.
So that's a great pattern to kind of talk about. So now another tool that we've talked about is the concept of AI. And what is the future of coaching with AI? What is the future of self-coaching with AI? One of the things that prompted me to be like reach out to you is like I was going over my social media history, and I made this post about Edbot 2.0 project that you had to put your 1,000 essays and all your coaching experience into an AI agent that was like a twin of you, and we could go ask Edbot questions. And that was really remarkable. And I just posted that, and that became like the third highest like social media post I had for the year. And the reaction was quite incredible. So there feels like a real need for exec coaching and AI and being able to leverage that. I'm just kind of curious, like, how did that start? Where is it going? Edbot 2.0, like, well, what does that world look like? What are your thoughts on the future of AI and exec coaching?
Oh yeah, I have many thoughts along those lines, Ian. Well, first, just give you a little history of the Edbot, as my colleague Paul Loper actually deserves credit for giving it that name. So the idea started with, and I definitely I take credit for creating the corpus that this LLM has been trained on, but it wasn't my original idea to do that. The original idea came from the guys who founded a company called Heyday, and they. So my site has always been published under a Creative Commons license, which means it's freely available for people. It's not copyrighted by me, and that goes back to my sort of roots as a blogger back in the early 2000s. I just feel like that's, my business model personally is I monetize my time and I make my content freely available. And so the guys at Heyday scraped my site and trained a kind of an LLM that they had built on it. and then shared that with me, and I was surprised. They hadn't asked my permission. They just went ahead and did it. That they would have had my support anyway. And so there was this sort of rudimentary Edbot available for, I think, most of 2024. So they sold their company to BetterUp, which is a kind of a large firm that kind of matches coaches with employees in large companies. And at some point, BetterUp said, "Hey, we're going to take the Edbot offline." And then earlier this year, a coach and colleague who's become a friend of mine, a guy named Tariq Karula, based in New York. So he's a former founder turned coach and has some technical chops that I definitely don't have. He reached out to me and said, "Hey, the Edbot's offline. Can we make a new one?" And I have been eagerly partnering with him. He's been doing all the technical heavy lifting. He was able to, so for a period, OpenAI offered what they called a custom GPT platform. And so Tariq basically trained a version of the custom GPT on the corpus of my website. And that's what is now that's what's now powering the Edbot. Actually, as of this weekend, Tariq and I are in an active dialogue to figure out what's the technical future. How do we, because it's not, OpenAI doesn't seem to be, they may be deprecating this custom GPT platform, but we will continue to provide it. And I have found it very interesting. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on it. More broadly, I think the future of AI and coaching, I think AI is going to have a significant impact on coaching, just as it already has with customer service and really like any helping profession. I am not particularly worried about, and I think a much broader scheme or a broader development that we've seen in the last couple of months is, in some circumstances, yes, AI will just sort of replace the human in the loop. But in most circumstances, there will be a human who will be augmented by AI, or there will be a helping relationship that is augmented by AI. So I'm not in the least concerned that the need for my services personally is going to disappear. I do think the shape and the contour of coaching as a profession will change quite a bit, and I think in some ways my relationship with clients will change. So I think a lot. I mean, and we are still, of course, in very, very early days, but I think we will see increasingly lifelike sort of service providers, avatars that will be, of course, readily available at very low cost to folks who these days don't have access to a coach. So I think there will be a form of coaching that will be delivered via, exclusively via AI. And I think we've also seen that people are very comfortable. A lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people are very comfortable, having fairly like meaningful and intimate exchanges with, various representations of AI. So I think we're going to see, everything from customer service to, coaching to therapy, I think will be very, very influenced by the intervention of avatars. And I think there will continue to be a need for a human in a variety of ways. And it's not on the basis of encyclopedic knowledge, right? Because I have been doing this for 20 years and almost 10,000 hours, I do bring a lot of encyclopedic knowledge, but that's, even today, that's not the basis of how I add value. It's not, I'm not like saying, "Hey, I've got the answer to every one of your, questions or the solution to every one of your problems as a leader." I think one of the ways that I add value that I think will always be true is the experience for the client of being witnessed by a fellow human being. I think there's something special about that. There always is, and there always will be. I think it's a little bit like watches, right? And I know you're a watch guy, right? So like cheap quartz timepieces tell time far more accurately than, the most expensive watches. But we still, at least, watch guys still buy, the value of the handmade watch is in knowing that another human being constructed this. Right. It's, and of course, the most accurate are extremely accurate, but still there's going to be a cheap quartz powered timepiece that will probably be, far more accurate and have all of these functions that, a handmade watch doesn't have. But we still value the human element in the construction. That's what makes a watch an heirloom in a way that a quartz timepiece never will be. And I think there's some kind of parallel. We value the experience of being with and being being understood by and bearing witness to a fellow human being. Now, that's absolutely going to be augmented by AI. So, I have clients who use the Edbot on a regular basis and bring some of the results of that into our coaching conversations. I have clients who take all kinds of written materials that they might have otherwise discussed with me and plug it into the Edbot and find the results quite stimulating. So in some sense, the coaching conversation is a distillation of a much larger process that I think will be increasingly augmented by AI. And some coaching conversations will be obviated, right? There's no longer the need to have the conversation with another human being. But I think coaching and all of the helping professions, at a certain point, you want a human. And yet, I think what we can accomplish with AI will be, I'm pretty excited about it. Now, I'm also, I'm not heedless about the negative impacts and the externalities and the I have concerns. I mean, one of the things I think about is, if you're just getting started as a coach, some of the opportunities that were available to me 20 years ago might no longer be available because some of that work might be absorbed by AI. So I'm by no means like just an enthusiast and saying, oh, AI is going to make everything easier and wonderful. I do have concerns about what the impact will be, in the broader social landscape. But I'm also not. I'm by no means a doomer. I'm by no means like, oh, we should try and stop the tide. No, I actually think a lot of good things are going to happen, and I think we need to be thinking very carefully as a society about how to address the negative impacts.
Yeah, 100%. I'm one of those folks that really enjoyed Edbot. One of the things I found on having Edbot was it was like an executive coach, but also pretty analytical. So I could throw it a problem, and it would it would list out the pros and cons, and then it would automatically create a 2x2 matrix with like, well, if you think these are the most important factors, here are the recommendations. I was just kind of like, wow, it's really nicely organized. So
Totally,
so hope
totally.
forward to Edbot, I guess 3.0 or 4.0 as it evolves. So excited about that.
Yeah, once Tariq and I agree on the right technical platform, I feel very committed to maintaining it, and it's also it's been a really fun experiment, right? It's offered me a lens into this evolving world, which most of my clients are involved in some way, shape, or form that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so we have maybe a rapid fire round to close off the
Okay.
discussion. All right, so rapid fire, a tool or a mental model you return to again and again.
It's very simple, but the Eisenhower matrix, right? If we have that classic 2x2 of importance and urgency, I think about this all the time. I talk with clients about it all the time. I use it myself, and it's attributed to President Eisenhower. I'm not sure if he's really, responsible for it, but yes, that's my favorite.
100% agree a lot on that one. All right, a next one, a coaching lesson you learned the hard way.
You know, I um I often think about a woman I worked with many years ago, and we had conducted what I thought was a very successful engagement about a professional transition that she wanted to move from one field to another. And near the end of the engagement, it was clear that she wasn't moving forward with that. And I got curious about that, and we began to unpack what was going on. And what we surfaced was that she was embarking on a major life transition, but what was really up for her was the fact that she was not in a position to become a mom and really wanted to become a parent. And I was really struck by, well, why didn't that surface in the course of our work together? And her perspective was, well, I didn't, this was executive coaching. I didn't think I could talk about that. And it taught me the importance of really ensuring that clients feel free to raise whatever issue is up for them, and that again, because what's going on in our professional lives affects what happens in other domains of life, and what happens in other domains of life certainly affects what happens in our professional lives. So coaching isn't therapy, but the clients, I want clients to know that they are free to raise whatever's up for them, and we will ultimately focus on their professional effectiveness, but we'll do so as effectively as possible when they feel free and they feel invited by me, not compelled by me, but invited to raise whatever's on their mind.
Yep, 100% makes total sense to discuss the full context. All right, next one. One thing leaders consistently misunderstand about themselves.
Um, that the impact and the intent around communication are different things, right? And this is related to something we talked about earlier with force and power. Um, it's very rare that a leader intends, to upset somebody or intends to make somebody frightened. And yet the fact that that isn't your intent as a leader doesn't mitigate the fact that that may have been the impact that you had. And so I think, and this gets harder the more successful you are, right? The more successful you are, the more prominent a figure you are, the more you're going to have an unintended impact. And so being able to kind of see yourself, and there's this great metaphor from the leadership literature. Can you get up on the balcony and simultaneously watch yourself on the dance floor? I think that's very relevant here. Can you observe yourself as you're communicating and interacting with people, and can you observe your impact on them, because it may be very distinct from the intended impact.
Yeah, I love that. Being on the balcony and watching yourself on the dance floor at the same time.
And that's all credit to Ron. All credit to Ron Heifetz. That's not my metaphor. That's Ron Heifetz's metaphor.
Excellent. Well, whoever it is, that's a great tool I'm going to take away from this. All right, couple last ones. A book or idea you'd recommend more than anything else?
You know what? I'm gonna step out of frame for one. I wanted to go to my bookshelf and get this high
Oh my God, I
output
got the same one.
management. There you go. All right, and it's a classic for so many reasons. One is, he was a successful guy, and Intel was a successful company when he wrote this. But it was earlier in his career. I mean, I think he started pulling it together in the late '70s. I think the first edition was published in '81 or '82, and it's kind of a kitchen sink book. I don't know that he ever thought he'd write another book. And Only the Paranoid Survive, which you mentioned earlier, is also a good book. And I'm not going to say that every chapter in this is gold, right? There are some chapters you're like, but it's, he was a chemical engineer, and he takes a chemical engineer's kind of mindset and applies it to the life of an executive. And I find that so useful and provocative, just thinking about like the leader's time as a resource, thinking about attention as a resource. There are so many, I think, powerful ideas that come out of this book. I refer to it again and again. And again, it's not something where it's like you're going to read every chapter and think it's amazing. Some chapters are like, okay, it wasn't that great, but there's so much gold in there.
100% agree. Yes, we actually read that a few times, and you get a lot out of it as you said, as I've grown. All right, maybe last rapid fire, a change you'd love to see in how leaders approach personal growth.
That it's a lifelong process. I think leaders sometimes fail to appreciate that their personal trajectory is going to sort of diverge from the company's unless they continue to invest in themselves. That they are necessarily and of course leaders bring a tremendous set of like superpowers to bear on their circumstances. It's why they become leaders in the first place. And the theme that comes up in my work quite a bit, superpowers have shadow sides. So you've got to, just saying, hey, I will do what got me here. Well, as the cliche goes, that may not be what is needed. May not get you there. It may not be what's needed in the next stage or chapter in the company's evolution. So are you investing in yourself, not because you've got to keep like learning the same lessons or get better at the at the same particular set of skills, but simply because what is asked of you may be radically different in a stage in the company's development, and what were your characteristics that were strengths in a certain stage of the company's development may actually be getting in the way, may be preventing you from achieving what will be most useful for the company. And to me, a critical factor, and certainly something that you and I have talked about, is how do you lead leaders, right? When you reach a point where you're actually able to bring on people if you're a CEO and you're bringing on executives who are, who have far deeper domain, expertise than you do, who may have been doing their jobs longer than you've been doing yours, who may be better at their jobs than you are at yours. How do you add value to that collection of senior executives? So, when I'm working with folks who are later stage CEOs and who've had the ability to kind of attract that kind of talent, they often have to rethink, how do I lead? How do I lead these leaders? Because they don't need me to solve their problems for them in the same way that my early stage employees did a few years ago.
Yep. That's awesome. Ed, thank you so much. Just in our time together, really appreciate your joining and speaking the podcast. In our time, we've known each other for so long, and I learned so much just in this conversation. So, Ed, thank you for being with us. This is a really great conversation.
My pleasure, Ian. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. If you like this content, please join our LinkedIn group. Please thumbs up, please comment, please subscribe. We'd love to bring more of this content to you.